Hey, reader, this is Centaur here. And as promised, for those of you who watched the errata video, this is the multiple rocket launchers video, where we talk about issues that I've had with multiple launchers, mostly in teaching them. Playing against them, it's tricky. You have to think about it. But I found in second edition, it was relatively easy to work around them if you had the right tools. In third edition, it's a little more complicated just because there tend to be more of them. But still, like, one can work out a solution. One can work out tools to fix them. And I'm glad that I waited to record this, as I mentioned in the errata video, because the intention had been to make the video, and then I got sick, and because I got sick, I got lazy, and I put off making the video. And the next day, the errata dropped, and the rules about multiple rocket launchers changed. So toward that end, low-key glad that I decided to wait. And now you're getting this video, which is going to include the most recent update to the rules for multiple launchers as of February of 2025 for third edition. So similar to the light mortars video, which if you haven't seen it, I'll link to it, hopefully maybe with a card if I figure out how to do that over here. I'm going to be using a similar itinerary. Okay, we're going to start off by looking at what the kind of the concept behind rocket artillery is supposed to be in a World War II game, what it should and shouldn't be able to do. We're then going to do a comparison of second edition and third edition wording just so we can get an idea of how it ought to work, and then in practice, like how that's translated into the rules. And that's going to lead us to some confusion and some interesting choices that went into the wording of the rules, as well as some oft forgotten parts, things that people might forget in the moment because of the fact that multiple launchers work so differently from other things. We're then going to talk about the difficulties that this can create in teaching this element of the game to new players, which has been a big part of my life recently, as I'm currently trying to build a stronger network out where I currently live amongst both my, old school Lord of the Rings role gaming buddies, while also talking to new people, brand new people who have never played a tabletop war game before, and the tricks that this particular element of the game brings to that. And then we're going to shift from there into the gameplay and the feel issues. I'm going to link to this down below, and I'll talk about it more when I get to that section. But Bo Mortensen has done a great video talking about this. And of course, he's played it like high-level international competitive play. Um, Mine is more so what I've seen in a localized meta and trying to have fun with friends in a casual game night at someone's house. But the same concepts apply, and I do think this is something that thus requires some fixes. So we're going to talk about some quick fixes, how the errata helps to fix some of this, because I'm actually very much pro the new errata. I think the new errata is great for streamlining and simplifying some aspects while taming back and reining in certain things that could easily be used for abuse. And then after that, we will talk a little bit about strategy and tactics, because I've seen some hand wringing, as a generous way of putting it, people talking about how it's no longer worth it to take multiple rocket launcher systems, and I'm not sure that's actually true. I disagree on that. But yeah, near the end of the video, we'll talk about that. And if I'm completely off base, I've only been playing the game for about 2.5 years, so please tell me, because I look forward to hearing it. And we'll go from there. So to start off with, what is rocket artillery and where did it come from? So the baseline for this in the European sphere and how European weapon design comes about, we can really trace back to the Hundred Years' War, in the 1330s at the least, with the development of the Ribald gun, the organ gun, whatever you want to call it. Leonardo da Vinci actually has a schematic for these. And the concept of it, as you can see, is pretty straightforward. It's, yeah, we could have a cannon, or we could have 10 cannons, right? That are all like right next to each other, and we could preload them and get them all ready. And then we can fire them all off at once. And that will be more effective than if we just fire them off all one at a time, each of them requiring their own crew. It's just, it will help with things, right? And this was clearly a purely anti-personnel weapon for how it was designed. It was designed to shred through ranks of men all standing together, using pikes and crossbows, and then later on arquebuses, and then later on muskets and flintlocks and things like that, right? And this concept begins to evolve over time. By the time you get to the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s, you start seeing the organ gun begin to fall away, mostly because of range. It's a relatively short range gun. People are starting to lean more toward indirect fire from, guns ranging from, a few pounds to several pounds worth of shot. And then the British start kind of playing around with rocket artillery, which you can see there. It's interesting. It's a frame of wood holding up another slat of wood, and then you've got a rocket with a long pole that's attached to it, lit off, and then it goes. And the pole is really just there for stabilizing. It's the same concept behind a javelin, effectively, right? If you've got, weight at the front that's being projected forward, if you include a longer shaft, it helps to give it a little more stabilization because wind pressure and stuff like that. Physics stuff that I know a little bit about, but not much. It's highly inaccurate. It does help a little bit at Waterloo, so says at least one source that I read about. But yeah, on the whole, it's highly inaccurate at the time. But this concept, organ guns, rocket artillery, it's continually dabbled with throughout this time period. And you see limited use of both of these by the time you reach World War I suspect because the relative width, depth, whatever you want to call it, for a trench makes it so that rocket artillery is really not particularly useful. So the howitzer kind of comes really into its own during that one. And so the war mostly focuses around howitzers as regards field artillery, but people are still tinkering with these ideas. You still see them popping up every now and then. And by World War II, when the Germans are bringing it out, when the Soviets are bringing it out, when later on the Americans are bringing it out, we do see these concepts kind of married together. What if we put a lot of rockets in a small space, fire them all off as a salvo, and then admittedly spend a long time reloading them, but then it will hopefully increase the effectiveness of all of them by virtue of the fact that one system with a smaller number of crew was able to do all of this output. It's still not accurate, right? We haven't gotten to the level of, modern day rocket-based artillery, which is highly accurate. It's designed for precision, and still designed for multiple uses and multiple shots. But what it's really there for is the fear factor, right? If a lot of stuff around you is blowing up, even if you are fine, you might consider leaving your position or surrendering, at which point the artillery has done its job, okay? And so when we look at second edition, we have some wording things. I think things is the best term to use here, okay? There are some issues with how this works out. What you're seeing on screen is the exact same thing twice. First is how it appears in the rulebook in second edition, and the second is the exact same wording, but with underlining in different colors to show different aspects of what's happening. So the first sentence, and this is good for game design, by the way, is just background. What is this supposed to encapsulate? In this case, it's multi-barreled rocket-firing weapons, and they give a couple of examples so you can look them up online. Fantastic. Then we get our first thing. It's counted as a heavy mortar. Okay, fair enough. I've got a weapons table. I can look that up. That's fine. And its chances of hitting never gets any better than a 6. No ranging in. Huh. Okay. So it's an indirect weapon that cannot do the thing indirect weapons are able to do. Okay, fair enough. I can take one change. That's fine. However, every time you fire it, pick the first target unit as normal. Fantastic. Know how to do that. And then check which other enemy units, okay, are within 6 inches of the original template. Okay, now that's an important word. It's a template. It's not the unit. Okay. These are also targets. Oh, wow. Okay, so this is designed to hit an awful lot of things. Got it. If you find there is a friendly unit within 6 inches of the original template, you cannot fire and the shot is wasted. Oh, okay. This is the only time in the game where an indirect fire weapon has to consider friendly units. But okay, good to know. And then once the target units have been selected, we check to see if they're within minimum range. That makes sense. Typically have to check for minimum range, especially with indirect fire weapons. And if that happens, then also misses automatically on only the units that are within the minimum range. Okay, good to know. And then we roll to hit for all remaining targets, one at a time in any order. Oh, interesting. So I can pick them in any order I like. And then I work out the total number of hits inflicted on each unit. I have to grab the template. Thankfully, the templates are all the same template. I don't have to switch them out. And then I roll damage. And then there's the line at the end that just mentions that you treat it as a light howitzer for the purpose of tows. Okay. That way they don't have to create a whole different system in the towing system for how you move these things around. For what it's worth, by the way, I don't have a problem with them being the same as light howitzers. Your average light howitzer is roughly about 800 pounds. Your average Nebelwerfer, which is the one I was able to find multiple references to an empty and loaded weight, is roughly about 1,100 to 1,300 pounds. Your nearest medium howitzer is like 4,000 pounds. So, yeah, as regards to closeness, it's fine. I think treating it like a light howitzer is okay from a from a design perspective. But you can see here how many things there are that's going on, right? When you compare this to other special rules, compare this to the howitzer special rule, right? Same category of weaponry, it's the same style of weaponry in general. The howitzer special rule just says you can fire direct or you can fire indirect. Simple, right? It's easy. This is that and more, okay? And when you look at this, there's a high chance that a new player is going to glaze over. And that's definitely what I did the first time I read it. Like, I understood the concept behind it. Okay, this is a thing where you get to pinpoint one and you might hit more, but your chances of hitting are relatively low. So you're really playing the odds on trying to catch 3 or 4 units that are near each other, clustered up, and then you're good, right? But I didn't run one for like the first 6 to 8 months because I'd be reading through this and I realized how many caveats and provisos and limitations there were. And so I didn't end up going for it. Okay, other people ran them and that was fine. But like I looked at this and it was confusing, and I've been playing war games for over 10 years by the time I jumped into bolt action. So naturally, when third edition came around, my first thought was, I wonder if they're going to change how multiple rocket launchers work and make it a little bit simpler, make it a little easier. And so the third edition wording, as we look at it, is surprising because if you look at it, it's the exact same wording. Admittedly, we italicize names like Nebelwerfer and Wolfram and Katushka, right? Things like that. But it's the exact same wording with one exception. Right when they talk about rolling to damage, they then do a paragraph break. And before we get the when towed, they count as light howitzers, we get another section talking about how they receive a pin marker every time that they fire, kind of representing the fact that, again, like there's choking smoke and there's a lot of sound. There's, as somebody who works, by the way, with injured veterans for a living, there's some tinnitus going on when you're that close to all of this stuff. Like there's just a lot happening. They now suffer a pin on themselves every single time they fire. Fair enough. But it's still the same wording, basically. And the errata has since added in a little bit to the second sentence to mention that, they hit only on a 6. It's treated as a heavy mortar, but it's a heavy mortar with a minimum range of 36 inches. Okay. But that's the only errata that we have to this. Otherwise, the text you're looking at currently on screen is the rules for multiple launchers. Okay. And this can create some problems when you're teaching the game to people. First of all, because we have rule breaking everywhere in this. The first sentence has no rule breaking. From that point on, everything is breaking rules. It's a mortar, but it can't range in like other mortars. So even though typically when I teach people how to play the game, we start with officer, 2 infantry squads, quick 15-20 minute game. And then we go on to officer, 2 infantry squads, another officer with a machine gun team and a mortar. So that way we can teach base of fire, both direct and indirect, and maneuver. Right? It's simple stuff. And then typically game 3, we'll like break for lunch on that Saturday. And then game 3 will involve tanks because people like tanks, right? That's fundamentally the reason why. It makes the game fun. And then, we'll teach artillery and stuff like that for the second or third game. Part of the reason why I don't include artillery is because somebody might ask about the howling cows I own or, something like that. And I just don't want to have to tell them it's too complicated to learn on day 1. But it is a little bit because you're teaching them a rule, like here's how mortars work. And then you have to tell them this is how mortars work, but it isn't how mortars work. And even post errata, now it's this is how mortars work. And here's the profile for a heavy mortar, which it says is what it counts as, but it's actually different from the profile that you see, right? So there's that aspect. There's extra steps. You select your target, you measure to the target, then you measure again by measuring around a template around that target, not actually from a model, right? Which typically in this game we measure model to model. That's how most measurements work. We aren't doing that anymore. And then we roll to hit multiple times, and then we're rolling to wound, possibly multiple times. There's extra steps being thrown in there that are only ever seen on this particular weapon. Again, we're also measuring two models, and then we stop measuring model to model like we normally do, and we measure from a template to models so we can place more templates, right, on top of those. So that's different. It doesn't happen anywhere else. We have automatic misses from range and affiliation, which is normal for direct fire weapons, right? Because if you would fire within an inch of your own unit or, over your own, through your own unit, then the shot automatically misses. We're already familiar with that. We're also familiar with missing because you're beyond your maximum range, right? In this case, we can automatically miss because it's beyond our maximum range, which is admittedly hard to do when your maximum range is 72 inches, but it could happen if you're way in the corner and you're firing to the opposite diagonal corner. You can also miss for firing it within your minimum range, which is much more likely now than it was before when it had a minimum range of 12 inches. And you can also miss if you would cause damage to someone of your same affiliation, which is different. No other indirect weapon does this. And then, of course, there's the question of pinning yourself when you shoot. This is also the only weapon that pins itself every time it shoots. Although now I think about it, I feel like there might be some like inexperienced janky tank or, oh, no. It's one of those artillery pieces for, it sounded like the British or the Americans. That was kind of like it was purely designed to be used in an anti-aircraft role, but you could potentially turn it down. And so anytime that it fires direct fire against a ground target or something like that, there's a chance it pins itself because it could like hurt its own mechanism or whatever. I never see it used. I would probably never use it for that very reason. It's too many points in one place for not enough value, and it can pin itself. Like why would I do that? But we'll see if that changes. I don't think it's in the current rule book, so we'll see if that changes in the Army books, whether that's present. But suffice it to say, it's one of the few cases where you see this, of you pin yourself when you do stuff. So now when I'm teaching somebody the game, I have to teach them how to play the game. I have to teach them the basic concepts they're going to use 90% of the time. And then I have a proviso-laden, this is how you use this piece. And that's not fun to teach, okay? Because I want my friends to easily grasp the game to keep them excited about the game. I also need to teach it to them because if they play against somebody who isn't from our group, that person might bring a multiple rocket launcher. And the last thing you want is for your friend to be blindsided by something they don't understand, that they're seeing for the first time, that would have dramatically changed the way that they did deployment and movement and other stuff like that. It'll cause them not to have as much fun. So you have to teach it. It's just a bear to teach, okay? The other issue when it comes to multiple launchers is I kind of lied earlier. I told you that the rules for multiple launchers were what was on screen. It's actually not true. We had the issue here of what I like to call rule division, which is where the rules for a specific item are actually present in multiple places. You can't go to one place to find everything. In this case, you go to the unit entry to find out how many men something has, what their veterancy is, what their unit cost is. Fair enough. Instead of going straight to a weapons chart like we normally would, we now have to go to a special rule to tell us what we're using, which requires us to then check the weapon chart for something like the heavy mortar stats. With the provisos, of course, that we're now also factoring in an errata to tell us what we need to change about that weapon stats. And then we have to go to the building rules to see how multiple rocket launchers work as regards buildings, because they're the only unit in the game that can target an empty structure and use that as its initial target. Which is why, by the way, it just talks about template. It doesn't say HE template, because the template for the initial target could be a 3-inch template that you center on a unit or that you place somewhere over a unit, right? Some unit that, whatever it is that you're firing at. It could be centered if it's on a vehicle. It could be centered if it's on a one-man team. But it could also be just between units if it's a multi-model team. But if they're in a building, if you're firing in a building, either because the unit's in the building or because you're firing at an empty structure, the template of the building now becomes the template you measure from, which is why they word it that way. It would be really nice if in the special rule for multiple launchers, it mentions when shooting at buildings, see page whatever. That would be really swell, okay? But it isn't there. So now we got to thumb through the book multiple places in order to find everything to know that we're playing the game legally. And then there comes the interactions with terrain. And this is kind of leading into what we just talked about. First of all, it's the only weapon system that can target something that's empty, right? Target basically a point on the map as opposed to an actual unit, which is potentially problematic because, as we'll see in the next one, when we talk about actual gameplay, if you're trying not to make multiple rocket launchers overpowered, there's a lot more that goes into how you choose terrain and what kind of terrain you're choosing to position where, because you're playing around the potential for a multiple rocket launcher in a way that you don't really have to do with any other element of the game. So now when I'm telling my friends, hey, consider jumping into this particular type of terrain or consider hiding behind this type of terrain, that's a good strategy for how to play this game, all of that advice goes out the window the moment you start talking about a multiple rocket launcher. Hiding behind a forest is a good way to keep a mortar safe if you have a spotter. Unless you're within 6 inches of another unit, and since the multiple launcher rule does not require you to have line of sight to the other units that you can hit, that unit now can fire at a unit that it can't see. And it's the only unit in the game that can fire at a unit that it and or its spotter cannot see. It's the only one because it breaks rules everywhere. Okay. And as somebody, by the way, very, very short plug for the next minute or so. I don't know if you play RPGs. I've been playing a traditional tabletop roleplay game since about 2011 or so. So slightly before I got in, right around the same time I got into wargaming. Shortly after I got into wargaming, and I created my own RPG system. So I've written rules before. Our game system isn't nearly as popular as the games you've probably heard about. The Warriors Return is not particularly a commonly played game. We're very niche, but one, we did have to go through a lot through rules, and we workshopped the rules an awful lot. We tested it with over 100 people before we ever pushed the book. We caught an awful lot of typos, and it paid off. So for the record, I get it. Okay, making games is difficult. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of time. You can't fix everything, especially if you want it to feel the way you want it to be. I get it. I'm not trying to complain about that. What I am going to say here is I think, as a general rule, the KISS theory for game design, keep it simple, stupid, is a good way of designing games because it makes it easy for new players to jump in. And we see keep it simple concepts everywhere. Howitzers, great example, right? Similar concept, similar style. It's a simple rule. It's easy to read, okay? Even something that has a few more words in it, like fanatics, also relatively easy to understand. Stubborn, easy to understand. There are a couple of things in this game that are not very easy to understand. Flamethrowers, which we're going to talk about in a future video, not the most intuitive thing. Get a lot of questions on those whenever we're playing with them. Multiple rocket launchers, another case. And I do think that this can be simplified. Okay. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I do see this as one of the downsides of multiple rocket launchers. It's just a bear to teach new players, but they do have to know it for their own help later. But that's not where the problems end. We then end up with gameplay issues. Okay. One of the most common complaints about it is that it's a very low strategy or boring way to play. And I get it. This is a very, the term you'll sometimes see thrown around is kind of like a beer and pretzels way to play the game, right? The concept being like, here's a guy who, he's drinking beer, he's eating pretzels, and he's pushing around his war game minis. He's not playing a high tactical strategy game. He's just there kind of carousing with the friends. Now, first of all, the fact that, hey, just kicking back, having fun, playing a low strategy game aside, as long as you're having fun with your friends and your friends are having fun, who cares, right? And in that sense, I don't necessarily see it as a negative. I play Catan. Catan's a relatively low strategy game. There's not a lot there, and my friends and I have fun with that, okay? But I think with a tabletop war game, the problem that it leads to is that a person who is not even trying to have skill and is really just chasing, if I roll a ton of dice, eventually I'm going to roll sixes. And if I roll sixes, I'm going to win in a 6-sided dice game, right? There is a legitimate complaint that it makes the game less interesting, less fun, and it can drive people away from the game that would otherwise play. And I think that's a fair concern. It's also slower dice resolution. So, when you're resolving an order dice, most order dice, when you resolve them, are actually relatively quick. Once you decide who you're going to assign a dice to, resolving it for pretty much any other unit in the game, including flamethrowers, is relatively fast. There's a lot of math. I mean, you basically bring back the geometry phase from other games when you're doing a multiple rocket launcher. Because yes, you choose who you're going to shoot at, but then there's the measuring out of, okay, well, here's my template, which, doesn't sit neatly around here. So my hand's going to move and wiggle a bit, which means may or may not catch something in there, right? Is something now within 6 inches? Is it not? Like there's just a lot of back and forth hemming and hawing. And okay, and then there's the normal stuff you got to check, right? Maximum range, minimum range, roll to hit, roll to wound. Except now that if we're hitting more than one, we're rolling lots of hits, we're rolling lots of wounds. And I can see the argument, the counterpoint that's probably going to be made in the comments by people who really like multiple rocket launchers, which is, well, it's a slower dice resolution a couple times. It's going to really speed up turns later because there won't be as many dice on the table. And I get that. The problem is that leads me to my next problem, which is swingy games, right? If the multiple rocket launchers are on fire, game's going to be fast. It's going to be super swingy. It's going to swing in one direction, and there's really not much you can do about it. Especially if you're doing something like quarters deployment, where you've got roughly about 5 square feet worth of space for probably between 15 and 20 order dice worth of units. Depending on which version you're playing, it could be even more than that. And in this case, those swingy games, there's no real way to hide from them. There's no way to spread out. There's no way to do anything, right? Even in a long board edge table deployment, you probably only have about 6 square feet. So you're looking at roughly 2 to 4 units in every square foot. You can technically make it a little more spread out if some of those are in a transport. You can, of course, keep units in reserve, but that's exactly what a multiple rocket launcher wants you to do as well, right? They want you to keep units in reserve. So that way there's a little more space for them to work and more time to hit you after they've taken out some of your friends. So again, I'm not a big fan of swing. I'm really glad one of my favorite changes they made in third edition is that preparatory bombardment got moved out of standard play, and more into narrative scenario style play. Because it was super swingy. Sometimes guys lost whole units, multiple units before the game even got started. Some guys walked away with just a couple pins, right? It was super swingy. It was lopsided. Um, and so because of that, I'm a big fan personally on removing things that are ultra swingy and don't require a lot of strategy. It's just luck of the draw, random rolls beyond the randomness we already have in the game with hitting values and wounding values. There's also wording arguments, right? So, like, you'll see some people who won't read the text clearly and they'll just start measuring who they're hitting based off of the unit that they're hitting because that's what they're used to doing, right? I mean, this is a unit to unit game. That's typically how it's done. You'll see people nowadays arguing about whether or not, spotters can be used, stuff like that. There's, are you up on the most recent errata as regards stuff? Like, we've already seen this coming out over the last week, right? There's already been wording arguments. And part of the reason why there are wording arguments on this is because of the fact that this is a really big block of text. There's nothing else to say about it. Whenever you have a big block of text, there's going to be arguments about it. And so, just by virtue of how much we're trying to pack in and all the provisos and limitations that are in it, it's going to cause problems. It's going to slow things down at the table. It causes terrain issues, which we've already talked about, right? How do you build a board that's not going to cause abuse against one side because they didn't bring multiple rocket launchers and the other guy brought a ton of multiple rocket launchers, especially in third edition? This is what I like to call aesthetic abuse, right? If you go on a table that's designed to look like a beautiful fight in downtown Paris and you've got a big cathedral and you've got a bunch of buildings and nice rows, if they can target a building and then they're drawing from that footprint, there might be nowhere to hide on the board. Especially since it's not like they have to see one of your units, which you can hide behind something. As long as they can see the roof of that building, per the building rules, they can shoot at it. Which means problems, right? There's now no way to get around it. And it's not because one side played a better tactical game, it's because somebody decided to build a beautiful board. It's because somebody decided to put out excellent terrain that they got from Micro Art Studios or Foreground, right? Or something like that, where it's just high quality, high end stuff. It's something that they got from a really cool 3D printer like a Dewey Cat Productions. And now, congratulations, we have terrain issues present in the game. And with the most recent errata making it so that you can, in fact, use spotters, it's even harder now to hide from stuff than it was before. And then comes, of course, the list building aspect that creates problems. So, under a standard rifle platoon, you could take potentially, if you're the right nation, because only a few nations can do this, Germany being the most prominent example, but Germany is also the most commonly played. Most people own a German army for a lot of reasons. Makes sense. Mostly, if you're getting into the game, you're probably going to get one Axis army, one Allies army to get started with, more or less. And that means since Germany fought everyone, and Japan didn't quite fight everybody, and the Finns didn't fight everybody, and the Romanians certainly didn't fight everybody, and the Bulgarians hardly fought anybody, and so forth. You're probably taking Germans, right? But with the Germans, you can take 4 Nebelwerfers or 4 Howling Cows in your artillery platoon, and you could take 5 Panzerwerfer 42s in your your other armor platoon. We'll see if the Renault UE transport is also back in the mix. I don't remember seeing it listed in the armies of Germany. That one's slightly cheaper because it's tinier and it doesn't have all of the cool abilities like the rotating platform for the Panzerwerfer 42. But hey, if you got 9 of these, you're putting 1 or 2 of them in every square foot of your deployment zone. You could be shooting 1 or 2 of them at every square foot of your opponent's deployment zone. You're going to hit a lot of stuff, right? Unless your opponent really starts spreading out and goes to the 4 corners of the map, in which case maybe that's what the rest of your army wants, right? And if you really dive into this, and I ended up building out the list just to see how it would work, at 1,250 points under 3rd edition, you can put 15 to 16 of these things in a single army list. Now you're running, inexperienced shirkers for your infantry and pretty small units at that. They're like, 4, 6-man, squads, right? So like, you have almost no protection for these things. But the 15 list includes 2 company commanders, which you'd probably want, just to make sure that your guys are in fact firing and that they're doing it every single turn, even if they get shot at. Even if they're down to 1 crewman left, they're still going to perform just fine. Because there are a lot of them there and there's a high amount of morale bubbles running around. So even pinning yourself is not nearly as big of an issue. Okay. So for people who really love strategy, all of these gameplay issues, especially considering this is a lot more than most things in the game get, and when put within the context of the fact that howitzers in general got toned back in 3rd edition, flamethrowers really got toned back in 3rd edition, the fact the multiple rocket launcher is basically the same, admittedly, post errata, slightly in a better position. I like this better. It's just a little weird that it wasn't adjusted with the new edition. Okay. So some simple fixes. The fix I was going to recommend is my super quick and dirty fix to make things better before the errata came out is basically just update the minimum range to match a medium howitzer, which is exactly what the errata did. I got pushed to a 36-inch minimum range. I chose the medium howitzer because it's the same damage potential. It's the same caliber shell, more or less, of what you're looking at with a heavy mortar. Heavy mortar is, typically up to, I think, a maximum about 120 millimeters. Medium howitzer is about a 105 millimeter. It'll vary a bit from nation to nation. But that kind of felt about right to me. Okay. And if that was the only fix you're doing, honestly, I think it works. It means that you just have to move up, right? You spend a turn moving up. If you decide to go with a new United States list and you go with the All Rangers list, you could potentially make it so that if you're deploying in a 12-inch deployment zone, or in a quarters deployment zone, as long as you're not moving on first wave, you could make it so that at the start of turn 1, all of your guys are pretty close to the middle of the board, and suddenly the multiple rocket launchers are not nearly as effective as they would have been, right? They can still work, and we'll get to that when we talk about tactics next. But suffice it to say, at least for now, like that on its own is a fine fix. It's fine. It's still a pain to teach. It's still not simple, and I know how I would change it, which is this down here. First of all, I would just give us a new unit weapon entry. The heavy weapons chart can hold 1 more. We have enough on there already. It's not a problem if it adds 1 more. And this is how I would design it. First of all, we're going to get rid of the whole you hit everything within 6 inches of you thing. We're getting rid of all of that because it's extra math. And instead, we're going to say this one fires 3 shots, which makes it, just shy. It's higher than any of the other big heavy weapons. It's only under machine guns in terms of its rate of fire, which is fantastic. We can set it as having a 36 to 72-inch indirect only range. And then maybe you include like an extra point cost for Nebelwerfers if you want them to be able to fire direct. And maybe direct is like 36 inches and under, right? But that can be a special rule that's attached to the unit entry. We don't have to mention that here in the weapon entry or in the special rule. We don't have to talk about that at all, right? Still make it HE 3 inches, 2d6 versus buildings, D3 pins, and give it the multiple launcher special rule, right? Similar to how some weapons have assault, things like that. People are used to looking up a special rule really quick. And when they look at it, all that the multiple launcher rule says is it says that this unit cannot range in, only ever hits on a 6. You mentioned that it can, and you don't even mention the whole only hit on a 6 thing, right? Because if a unit can shoot direct, we don't want to tell everybody that it's shooting direct, but it's shooting direct on a 6. We don't want to do that, okay? But then we mentioned that it can split its attacks between the target and other visible targets within 6 inches of the original target. Now, this means we're not measuring from a template. We're measuring from the unit. If the unit is in a building, that means that you count the the footprint of the unit as being the footprint of the building. Okay, it still works, but now you're not going to be, doing weird stuff of putting down a 3-inch template and holding it over stuff and then measuring out from there with your other hand and trying to figure out whether things are in range or not. We're going to skip over all of that. It also means that you could take your 3 attacks, and if you really want to get that sniper out of that building, you throw all 3 of them at it. And on average, that means that 3 attacks on 6s is roughly a 50% odds that you're going to get 1 6. Okay, more or less. Math is between 44 and 56%, depending on how you do the calculus behind it. But that's about equivalent to a 4+ to hit, which is pretty fair, right? Most howitzers are going to be looking at about a 4+ to hit. When you start factoring in things like pins, it's even likely that an AT gun's going to be hitting at around a 4+ to hit. So this is pretty accurate, right? This is pretty fair, I think, as regards chances of success. Yes, you can't nuke 7 units in a single turn. If you hit 3, though, that's still pretty good. And even if you only hit 1 of them, I think most artillery crews in the game would be pretty happy if they were getting roughly 1 hit every single turn. I think they'd be pretty happy with that, okay? And then the last thing that we would mention is that you have to we don't put any special rules in the building section regarding multiple launchers. They treat buildings like howitzers and mortars do. Can't fire at empty stuff. You fire at things normally, okay? Again, this just means we're going to one less place to find stuff. We go to the unit entry to find relevant information. In the case of a Nebelwerfer, maybe it also has a special rule that you can add on as a purchase, or maybe we just bump up the cost of the Nebelwerfer and it starts with that. And then we go to the weapon entry, like we normally would, which is tied to, and then that leads us to the special rule. Okay, we cut out 1 step to make it a little bit simpler. Okay. Is this the best solution to the problem? I think it follows the rest of the flow of bolt action, which makes me think it is a better option. It doesn't have the fire and brimstone fear factor that I think some people would like it to have. Fair enough. I think it just works better personally, but you don't have to include it, obviously. The quick fix they currently have with the minimum range is fine, okay? Now, we're going to get to the hand wringing. Some people are going to say now multiple rocket launchers are not worth using. Okay, they're going to say that they've been completely antiquated. We got to save them for 4th edition. They're not going to work because that 36 minimum range means that all of your enemies are pretty much going to be in range all the time, all game. And I don't think that's actually true. I think the reason why people think that way is because they're thinking in a Napoleonics way. And so because of that, when we talk about the strategy, what they're thinking is if you look at that bottom section where you see the 2 12-inch deployment zones, they're thinking about it as the Nebelwerfer is shooting directly down, right? They're shooting parallel. And because of that, sure enough, yes, 36 inches is going to be pretty oppressive. You're not going to hit pretty much anything. I think the answer is you're really going to be looking at corner deployment, and you're going to be firing in a diagonal, okay? Now, the arrows that you see there, obviously, we're not looking at 4 foot by 6 by 4 foot things. You're not even looking at 4-inch by 6-inch graphics. But the arrow does represent half of the long edge. Okay, they are the same length. And so because of that, that is done roughly to scale. And you can see that done in diagonals, your minimum range, which is represented by that red arrow, even if you're a good bit into your own deployment zone, you're not like directly on the very back line, you can still reach a good bit of the board, roughly about half of the board with each Nebelwerfer, okay? And obviously with a Panzerwerfer or whatever, if it's a mobile, vehicle-based weapon, then you even have even more ability because if somebody really starts rushing you, you could spend a turn running, getting way out from where you were, and then resetting up for next turn, continuing to shoot at people. Okay. I do think these are also going to require you to assign protection units. I think this is where the machine gun team comes in really handy. I could also see this being a place for LMGs in a rifle squad or something like that, where you have a unit that's put relatively close to them, Maybe you keep them beyond 6 inches if you know you're fighting against an enemy's, multiple rocket launcher. But if they don't have them, you can keep them a good bit closer and you're not going to overlap, right? You're not going to get hurt doing that. And this unit's job is to go in ambush or provide base of fire just to keep things away from the Nebelwerfer, right? Or whatever your multiple rocket launcher system is, okay? I think the next question is just whether you should use a spotter or not to use a spotter. So to spot or not to spot, that is the question, right? I think in general, having access to a spotter is a good idea. With the recent errata to spotters, this means that if you're going to use a spotter to spot for one, you're going to probably, you don't care nearly as much about switching between spotters because, you can't range in, right? So like, it's not like you hurt yourself per the new errata rules where, yeah, they're not sharing each other's notes on where exactly people's coordinates are, which I think is accurate, more or less, for the purposes of the war game. So, you can still bounce around, use whatever spotters you want to. I would probably still deploy them in such a way that they can still see things themselves, just because between snipers, LMGs, mortars trying to range in on a spotter, things like that. I just think it's too dangerous to rely on having a spotter present. You can technically still move these things around and lumber them around all by themselves if you lose your spotter and you need to move to a better place. But why wouldn't I just park them behind a stone wall and then shoot, maybe using a spotter, maybe not, all game? I feel like that's just a better way of doing it, right? So there's that. But it's up to taste to you, right? They can't actually take any spotters yet. They can't purchase spotters for themselves. So you need to have another unit in your squad that's providing the spotter for you, which is totally doable. Medium mortars are relatively cheap. Heavy weapons platoons and generals are pretty cheap. And if you're going to be taking machine gun teams for your protection units anyway, then yeah, you could take one or two medium mortars, maybe take them regular and add two spotters, and then those be spotters for the army. The one consideration I would take, however, when you're using multiple rocket launchers, if you want them to be effective, because of the whole, your shot automatically misses, you don't hit anything if there's a friendly unit within 6 inches of them, of the target. If you're going to use submachine guns in vast numbers, which really want to be within 6 inches of an enemy, realize that you're cutting off potential shots for your multiple rocket launcher. If you run flamethrowers, which have to be within 6 inches of the enemy in order to do anything, you are also cutting off options for your multiple rocket launchers. So while MLRS systems are really good and they can do some substantial damage, and for people who play like D&D and you like playing like the wild magic sorcerer who like does crazy stuff all the time and might turn themselves into a potted plant for a while, or might end up summoning a demon by mistake, or might end up healing themselves or changing their eye color or whatever when they randomly cast magic, like the multiple launcher is your weapon. Okay, I just don't know any other way to say it. Like, it's got the wild factor, it's got the random factor, it's got the, I had 5 shots and I missed them all moments. But it's also got the, I only had 2 shots, but I hit them both, sort of thing. Like it does all of that for you. And that's fun. It's good to have those kinds of things in certain games for certain people. Black Seas has this with their mortars as well. Those are also really swingy. My desire would be that it would be less swingy, right? That it provides that interesting bit of random factor, but not too much. Too much can be bad for the game. So personally, I'm not a fan of how the rule is worded. I would make some changes. See those yourself. I'll put those also in the Zern mission pack as a potential variant rule in case you want to use those for your tournaments. But just suffice it to say, at least for now, I think, like, I own a couple. I will still use them in 3rd edition. I'm not of the camp that says that they're completely useless now and that they can't be run and that it can't work and it won't, it's not viable. I am of the mind that they do require more tactical use to use effectively, which is good because it solves one of the problems that was originally present with the multiple rocket launcher. I think there's room for improvement, but I think where we stand right now, it's fine. It's going to take me some time to teach my guys. They will eventually get it because they're pretty okay. But that's my thoughts on multiple rocket launchers. If you have thoughts, please include them down below. Share this with your friends if you think it's interesting. Do the thingies that you know you're supposed to do over here if you like what you saw. And I will see you next time.